The night my mother was wheeled into my operating room, she looked up at me, oxygen mask halfway on her face, skin the color of old paper, and said, "Get me someone else." My name is Tessa Slater. I'm 38. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon at Lakeview Regional Medical Center in Minneapolis. She'd spent 20 years telling every person in our family that I wasn't cut out for this, that I got into medical school on a fluke, that she, Laureen Slater, had personally funded my entire education out of her retirement savings so her difficult, ungrateful daughter could play doctor. What she didn't know was that I'd been the lead CT surgeon on that floor for 3 years. I'd performed over 400 open-heart procedures, and that night, with her aorta tearing apart inside her chest, there was no one else, just me. The daughter, she said, would kill someone on the table. Now, I know you think you know where this is headed. You think she apologized. You think I stood over her and felt some kind of power. Hit subscribe and turn on that notification bell, because what actually happened in that OR, and what my father said in the hallway outside it, is something I still can't fully explain. I bet you can't guess which one of them broke first. Tell me in the comments. But to understand that night, I need to take you back to a Saturday morning in Burnsville, Minnesota, September 2005. I was 17, and I'd just told my mother I wanted to be a surgeon. Burnsville is one of those suburbs south of the Twin Cities where the houses all look the same, and everybody's business is everybody else's business. We lived on Ridgecrest Lane, a split level with brown siding that my dad had been meaning to repaint since I was 12. The kitchen had yellow laminate counters and a window over the sink that looked out at the Peterman's fence. That's where my mother was standing when I said it. She was loading the dishwasher. I was sitting at the table with a brochure from the University of Minnesota's pre-med program. I'd picked it up at the school career fair the day before, and I was excited. I was actually excited about something. I said, "Mom, I want to apply to pre-med." She didn't look up. She kept rinsing a plate, and she said, "Tessa, your brother reads a textbook once and owns it. You read it 5 times and still guess." She turned the water off, dried her hands on the towel hanging from the oven handle. Then she looked at me. "That's not medicine, sweetheart. That's gambling with someone's life." I remember the brochure was sitting between my hands on the table. I remember the specific weight of it. Glossy paper. I folded it in half and put it in my back pocket, and I didn't say anything else. The thing is, before that moment, and honestly even after it for a long time, I loved my mother. I need you to understand that. She wasn't cruel every single day. She made this lemon chicken on Sundays that the whole street could smell. She drove me 45 minutes to my regional science competition in 9th grade and waited in the car for 3 hours because she said the cafeteria chairs hurt her back. She braided my hair every picture day until I was 13. But there was always this line. And the line was Garrett, my older brother. 3 years ahead of me, first in everything, and in my mother's eyes, the only one of us who was going to matter. I didn't realize it then, but that morning in the kitchen was the first time she drew the map for my entire life. And I'd spend the next 20 years trying to walk off the edge of it. My dad was in the garage when that conversation happened. He was always in the garage. Dale Slater, 66 now, retired civil engineer, spent most of my childhood either at his drafting table at Consolidated Infrastructure or in our garage organizing his tool wall. He had this pegboard system where every single wrench and socket had its own labeled hook. I used to sit on the workbench and watch him sort things while he listened to AM talk radio. He was a quiet man. Not cold, quiet. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to understand it. He'd ask about my grades. He'd show up to every single school event. He once drove through a snowstorm to pick me up from a sleepover at 2 in the morning because I called him crying and said I wanted to come home. He didn't ask why. He just came. But when it came to my mother, when it came to Laureen, he went silent. Not once in my entire childhood did I hear him contradict her. Not once. Garrett applied to law school the same year I started undergrad at the University of Minnesota. He got into William Mitchell in St. Paul. My mother threw a party. I'm not exaggerating. She rented the back room at Buca di Beppo on Grand Avenue and invited 31 people. I know the number because I helped address the invitations. When I got my acceptance to U of M's pre-med track a month later, she said, "Good, now don't embarrass yourself." That was it. No party, no invitations, no back room. And here's the thing that really set the pattern. The thing I didn't find out until years later. When Garrett's tuition came due, my mother took $62,000 from her and my father's joint savings and paid his first 2 years outright. My dad told me this much later. $62,000 for Garrett. When my tuition came due, she sat me down at that same kitchen table and said, "Your father and I discussed it, and we think it's important for you to learn responsibility." I took out $23,000 in loans my first year alone. Now, my dad was sitting right there for that conversation. He was at the end of the table with his coffee. He didn't say a word. He just looked at his hands. And I remember thinking, okay, this is how it works. Garrett gets funded. I get lessons in responsibility. But the real betrayal, the one I wouldn't discover for another 12 years, wasn't the money itself. It was what my mother told people about the money. I need to back up and explain something about Laureen. She was a vice principal at Burnsville South High for 23 years. She knew how to manage a room. She knew how to manage a reputation. And she was, I'll give her this, she was smart. She didn't attack you where people could see. She attacked you where people could sympathize with her. So she started telling people she was paying for my medical school. Not just hinting, not just implying. She told my Aunt Phyllis, her sister. She told our neighbors. She told the women in her book club. She told everyone that she had drained her retirement savings to put Tessa through medical school because Tessa couldn't do it on her own. That she'd sacrificed $57,000 and was eating into Dale's pension to keep me afloat. Every word of it was a lie. I earned a merit scholarship that covered 60% of my tuition. The rest, $187,000 over 8 years of undergrad, medical school, and the gap between, I paid for with federal loans and a part-time research position in Dr. Randall Lau's cardiology lab that paid $14.50 an hour. I ate ramen and peanut butter sandwiches for 3 years. I lived in a studio apartment on Washington Avenue with a radiator that clanked so loud I had to wear earplugs to sleep. My mother never gave me a dime. Not one. But I didn't know she was telling people otherwise. I had no idea. I was busy. I was studying 16 hours a day. I was in the anatomy lab at 6 in the morning and at the library until midnight. I didn't have time to call Aunt Phyllis or check in with the neighbors. The first crack came in 2014. I was 27, in my second year of residency at Hennepin. I'd come home for Thanksgiving, which I almost never did because residents basically live at the hospital, and Aunt Phyllis pulled me aside in the kitchen while my mother was in the living room with Garrett and his wife. Phyllis put her hand on my arm and said, "Tessa, I just want you to know, I think what your mother did for you is remarkable. $57,000 at her age. I hope you appreciate what she gave up." I stared at her. I said, "What are you talking about?" And Phyllis looked at me like I was being ungrateful. She said, "Your medical school, honey. Laureen told me she emptied half her retirement to pay for it." I think I stood there for 10, maybe 15 seconds without speaking. The kitchen smelled like sage and butter, and I could hear Garrett laughing about something in the other room. And I felt this thing happen in my chest. Not anger yet. Something colder than that. Like the floor had moved 2 inches to the left and I was the only one who noticed. I want to pause here for a second. If you've ever had that moment, where someone tells you something about your own life and you realize they're living in a completely different version of it, then you know this feeling. It's not confusion. It's not even shock. It's this horrible, quiet recognition that someone has been building a story about you, without you, for years. If that hits close, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Even just a word. Because what happened after that Thanksgiving, what I found on my phone 7 months later, nearly broke me. Because what I did next, what I should have done, was confront my mother right there in that kitchen. But I didn't. I smiled at Phyllis. I said, "She's always been generous." And I went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub for 5 minutes, staring at the tile floor. I told myself it was a misunderstanding, that Phyllis had confused something, that maybe my mother had exaggerated a little but didn't mean it literally. I told myself a lot of things that night, but there was a new weight sitting on my chest when I drove back to Minneapolis, and it didn't go away. And the next time my mother called me, 4 days later, to remind me about Garrett's birthday, I listened to her voice differently. I listened for the seams. Because I was starting to realize my mother hadn't just told one lie. She'd built a whole house out of it. And I was the only person who didn't know what it looked like from the outside. The second crack came 7 months later, Tuesday, March 14th, 2015, and it was worse. I was in my 3rd year of residency. I'd been assigned to Dr. Veena Chakrabarty's cardiothoracic rotation. This was the rotation everyone wanted because Veena was a legend. She'd done over 600 mitral valve repairs. She was tough, quiet, precise. She didn't waste words, and she'd chosen me for her team, which at the time felt like the most important thing that had ever happened to me. That Tuesday afternoon, around 2:15, I was reviewing post-op notes in the residence lounge on the 3rd floor, and my phone buzzed. Group text from my cousin Reagan, Phyllis's daughter. It was a family thread I barely checked. Reagan had posted a photo of Laureen at some church fundraiser, and underneath it she'd written, "Auntie Laureen looking great tonight. Still recovering from all those sacrifices for Tessa's schooling, but out here serving the community anyway. Love this woman." 15 people had reacted with hearts. I scrolled up. There were older messages I'd missed. My Uncle Frank, Phyllis's husband, had written 2 weeks prior. Laureen told me they might have to push back their kitchen renovation again because of Tessa's loans. That girl better be grateful. My hands were shaking. I'm not being dramatic. My actual hands were trembling holding that phone. Because it wasn't just Phyllis anymore. It was Frank. It was Reagan. It was 15 people who all believed that my mother had bankrupted herself for me, and that I was some ungrateful burden who was draining her dry. I scrolled, looking for Garrett's name, because surely he, the one who was actually at that kitchen table, the one who'd received $62,000 himself, surely he'd said something. Surely he'd corrected the record. I kept scrolling, looking for some reply where my brother had pushed back, had written even one sentence of truth. And then I found his response. He'd written back to Frank. Mom's always been like that. Gives everything and asks for nothing. He knew. He knew she hadn't paid a cent for me. He was there at that kitchen table when she told me to take out loans. And he played along. He built the lie right alongside her. I went to the bathroom at Hennepin and threw up. I'm serious. I leaned over the sink in the staff restroom on the 4th floor, and I threw up. I called my dad that night. It was almost 11 p.m., and I could hear the TV in the background. He always watched the late news in his recliner. I said, "Dad, has Mom been telling people she paid for my medical school?" There was a long pause. Then he murmured, "Tessa, your mother says a lot of things." I said, "Dad, has she or hasn't she?" Another pause. Then, quiet, barely above the sound of the TV, he whispered, "She has." "And you didn't correct her?" "Tessa, did you?" "No," he breathed. "I didn't." And that was it. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He just said no. And I hung up the phone and sat on my bed in my studio apartment. And I didn't cry. I just sat there. Because the betrayal had just gotten so much bigger. It wasn't just Laureen anymore. It was Dale. It was Garrett. It was Phyllis and Frank and Reagan and 15 people pressing heart reactions on a lie. Everyone knew, except me. The weird thing about finding out your whole family is operating on a different set of facts than you are, it doesn't make you explode. Not right away. It makes you very, very quiet. I went back to work. I showed up for rounds. I assisted on a triple bypass that Thursday, and my hands were steady the entire time. I remember Dr. Chakrabarty looking at me over the drape during the procedure and saying, "Good hands today, Slater." And I thought, yeah, these hands are all I've got. I didn't confront my mother. Not yet. I know that sounds weak, and maybe it was. But I was in the middle of the most important rotation of my residency, and I had this awful, practical voice in my head saying, if you blow this up now, you blow up everything. So I waited. I filed it away. I kept showing up. And here's the thing about Laureen. She didn't need to be cruel every day. She had this rhythm. Weeks would go by where she was warm, normal, almost sweet. She'd text me pictures of the garden. She'd ask how I was sleeping. And then, always when I was off balance, always when I'd started to relax, she'd land something. Think about that for a second. What would you do if the person who raised you had been rewriting your life for other people, making your struggle into her sacrifice, your work into her charity? Would you confront her? Or would you do what I did? Keep your head down and let the lie grow because fighting it would cost you everything you'd built. I really want to know. Because looking back, I honestly don't know if I made the right choice. Drop it in the comments. What would you have done? But what happened next at Garrett's engagement party made waiting impossible. July 2016. Garrett was getting engaged to a woman named Danielle, a corporate recruiter he'd met at a bar association gala. My mother organized the party at her house. 60 people in the backyard. Catered. Twinkle lights. She'd spent 4 months planning it. I drove down from Minneapolis. I wore a navy dress I'd bought at Nordstrom Rack for $78 because I knew Laureen would notice if I showed up in scrubs. I walked into that backyard and I smiled, and I hugged people, and I played the role. About an hour in, I went to get a drink from the bar table. They had this whole setup with a bartender my mother had hired. I was waiting for my gin and tonic when I caught her voice from somewhere behind me. Not the words, the tone. That specific tone she used when she was performing for an audience. Low and warm, like she was sharing something in confidence. I took my drink and moved toward the corner of the house. I could hear fragments. Of course I worry about her. And then a laugh. That light, social laugh. I stepped closer, one hand against the siding, and my heel caught on the edge of a paving stone. I stumbled slightly, caught myself, held my breath. And then I heard it clearly. Her voice, steady and casual, talking to 3 of Danielle's relatives. She said, "I told her residency director to keep an eye on her. She puts on a good face, but she panics under pressure. She always has." Then she laughed again. Between us, I'm the one who got her through organic chemistry. She called me crying every other week. She never called her residency director. I know that because I asked, later. Dr. Chakrabarty confirmed no family member had ever contacted the program. But those 3 women standing there with their glasses of Prosecco, they didn't know that. They just heard a concerned mother sharing a private worry. And they nodded. And they probably looked at me differently for the rest of the night. My hand was shaking. The gin and tonic was spilling slightly over the rim, and I didn't notice until I felt it on my knuckles. I stepped back from the corner, turned, and almost walked straight into Danielle's mother, who smiled at me and said, "Are you okay, sweetie? You look a little pale." I said, "Just the heat." I smiled. I walked to the other side of the yard. Something shut off inside me. I don't know how else to describe it. Like a valve closed. The part of me that still wanted her to see me. The part that kept coming back. It went quiet. I stayed for another 2 hours. I gave a toast to Garrett and Danielle. I smiled in photographs. And I drove back to Minneapolis at 11:30 that night with the windows down and my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. That was the night I stopped waiting for my mother to change. And it's the night everything that came after started moving. Here's what nobody in my family knew, because I stopped telling them. After my residency, I was offered a fellowship in cardiothoracic surgery at Lakeview Regional. This was 2017. I was 30. Lakeview is one of the top cardiac programs in the upper Midwest. They do over 800 procedures a year. The fellowship acceptance rate is 11%. 11. Out of 93 applicants, they picked 4. I was one of them. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell Garrett. I didn't even tell my dad, not right away. Because I'd learned something by then. Every achievement I shared with Laureen became either hers or a threat. If she could claim credit, she did. If she couldn't, she minimized it. So I just stopped feeding her information. It's kind of funny, looking back. She thought I was still a resident. For 2 full years after I'd completed my fellowship and been hired as an attending surgeon, my mother was telling people I was still in training. She'd say, "Tessa's still figuring things out up there," at family dinners. I know because Phyllis mentioned it once on the phone. She called to invite me to a cousin's baby shower and said, "Your mom says you're still in residency. How much longer does that take?" I almost laughed. I was, at that point, the lead surgeon on a team that had performed 19 aortic valve replacements that month. But to my family, I was still figuring things out. By 2019, I was 32, and I'd been made co-director of Lakeview's cardiothoracic unit alongside Dr. Emmett Sorensen, who'd been running it for 14 years. The hospital CFO told me my surgical outcomes were in the top 3% nationally for my procedure volume. I'd published 2 papers. I had residents requesting my rotations specifically, and my mother didn't know any of it. The only person in my family who had a hint was my dad. Not because I told him directly, but because one Thanksgiving, 2018, he saw a hospital ID badge in my coat pocket when I stopped by the house briefly. It said, "Attending Physician, Cardiothoracic Surgery." He looked at it. He looked at me. He put it back in my pocket and said, "I won't say anything." I said, "I know you won't." That sounds harsh, I know. And I'm not proud of how it came out. But there was this calculus I'd been running in my head for years by that point. Every piece of truth I gave my family, Laureen used as a weapon. My achievements became her sacrifices. My successes became her investments. The only way to have something that was mine was to keep it from her entirely. Maeve Okoro. She was the anesthesiologist I worked with most frequently at Lakeview. She was the one who actually called me on it. We were in the break room after a 7-hour mitral repair, still in our scrubs, eating vending machine pretzels, and she said, "Tessa, when's the last time your family visited?" I said, "They don't visit." She said, "Do they know where you work?" "They know I'm at a hospital." Maeve just looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You know that's not normal, right?" And I said, "And this is one of those moments where you hear yourself and you think, oh, that's actually really sad." I said, "Normal doesn't apply to my family." Maeve didn't push it. She never did. But she started doing this thing where she'd mention my accomplishments out loud in front of other people. In staff meetings, in the break room. Slater just hit her 200th valve repair. Slater's paper got cited in the New England Journal. Little things, like she was building me a witness list for a version of my life that actually matched reality. I didn't know then how much that would matter later.
Christmas 2020. I'm 33. I drive down to Burnsville because my dad asked me to, and even then, I almost didn't go. The house smelled like the lemon chicken. The tree was in the same corner it had been in since I was 5. Garrett was there with Danielle. Aunt Phyllis and Uncle Frank were there. My mother was wearing this red sweater and pearl earrings, and she was holding court in the living room like she always did, telling some story about a student she'd mentored years ago at Burnsville South. I sat on the couch with a glass of wine and I watched her. I watched the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the way she touched people's arms when she spoke, the way she made everyone in the room feel like they were the most important person. Everyone except me. About an hour before dinner, I was in the hallway heading to the bathroom, and I passed the little side table where my mother keeps her photo frames. There's one from Garrett's law school graduation, one from his wedding, one of Garrett and Danielle in Cabo,
There was not a single photograph of me. Not my college graduation, not my medical school graduation, not my white coat ceremony. Not one. I stood in that hallway and I stared at those frames, and something very simple occurred to me. I don't exist in this house. Not the real me. The version of me that lives here is the one Laureen built, the struggling, ungrateful daughter who needed her mother's money and still hasn't figured things out. And then, during dinner, it happened. We were at the table, the same yellow counters, and Garrett started talking about a case he'd won, some corporate merger dispute. He was telling it with this animated energy, and Laureen was leaning forward, nodding, asking follow-up questions. And then she turned to me and murmured, "What about you, Tessa? Still keeping busy up there?" Still keeping busy. Like I was doing a puzzle. Like I was a child playing with a toy stethoscope. I looked at my dad. He was at the end of the table, same as always, same coffee mug in his hand. And I watched him do something that made my stomach drop. Laureen had barely finished her question when my dad cleared his throat and said, "So, Garrett, tell us about the Henderson brief. Wasn't that the big one?" He changed the subject. Steered the conversation right back to Garrett, like he was pulling a door shut before anyone could look inside. And I thought, he knows. He knows exactly what she's doing, and his answer is to redirect, not to push back. He will never push back. I set my fork down. I said, "I'm doing well, Mom. Thank you for asking." And then I finished my meal, and I helped clear the dishes, and I drove back to Minneapolis, and I didn't go home again for 2 years. If this story is hitting you the way I think it is, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. What happened next in that hospital changed everything. I should tell you, those 2 years were the quietest of my life. No holiday arguments, no carefully worded texts, no scanning family group chats for new lies. I just worked. I operated. I trained residents. I built something real with my hands every single day, and none of it had Laureen's name on it. I thought the distance would be permanent. I thought I'd designed my life so that her voice couldn't reach me anymore. But the thing about being a surgeon is, the hospital doesn't care about your family drama. It cares about who's on call. And on the night of March 9th, 2023, I was on call. I was in my office on the 5th floor of Lakeview, reviewing imaging from a scheduled aortic root replacement I had the next morning. It was 9:20. I had a cup of cold coffee on my desk, and the overhead lights were off. Just the glow from my monitor and the desk lamp. My pager went off. Trauma activation, cardiothoracic, incoming aortic dissection. Type A, 64-year-old female, en route via ambulance from a suburb south of the city. ETA 8 minutes. 64 years old, south suburb. I stood up. My body went into autopilot. That thing that happens after years of surgical training, where your hands start moving before your brain finishes processing. I was out of my office, heading to the elevator, pulling on my white coat. I paged Maeve. I paged the perfusion team. I ran through the protocol in my head. Type A dissection, surgical emergency. Mortality rate climbs every minute you wait. Nobody teaches you how to be steady. You learn it from every room where falling apart wasn't an option. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor, and I walked toward the trauma bay, and I saw the paramedics coming through the double doors. The gurney was moving fast. 2 EMTs. The patient was on supplemental oxygen, blood pressure cuff on the arm, IV line running. And then I saw her face. My feet stopped. Just for a half second. A half step backward that the paramedics didn't notice, but I felt in every nerve. I saw the yellow kitchen, the brochure, the laminate table. I felt my hands go cold inside my coat pockets. Then the training took over. Laureen Slater, my mother. Eyes half closed, skin gray-white, an expression of pain so naked it didn't look like her. She looked small. She looked old. The woman who had commanded every room she'd ever been in was lying on a gurney with her hospital gown twisted and her hands gripping the side rails like she was holding on to the edge of something. The charge nurse met me at the gurney. She said, "Dr. Slater, we've got a type A dissection, acute onset, started approximately 40 minutes ago at the patient's home. BP 90/55. She's your intake." I looked at the chart. Maureen M. Slater, DOB, August 19th, 1959, Burnsville, Minnesota. And here's what I need you to sit with for a moment, because this is the part that still keeps me up at night sometimes. Imagine you're standing in a hospital hallway, and the person on that gurney is the person who lied about you for 20 years, who undermined your career to your own family, who erased your achievements and replaced them with a story that made her the hero and you the burden. You've got the scalpel. You've got the skill. Would you operate? Would you trust your own hands not to hesitate? Or would you ask someone else to take over? I think there are really only 3 answers. You'd refuse, you'd do it and feel nothing, or you'd do it and carry it forever. Tell me which one you are. I need to know. Because what happened in the next 60 seconds is the moment everything I'd been holding for 20 years came apart. And it wasn't me who broke. Because standing behind the paramedics, still in his coat, still holding his car keys, was my father, Dale Slater. And he looked like a man who had just run out of silence. She was prepped in 11 minutes. Type A dissection, the aortic wall tearing, blood filling the pericardial space. Without surgery, hours, maybe less. I was giving orders. I was calm. The clock on the bay wall read 9:47 p.m. Then she opened her eyes. She saw me. I was standing at the foot of her bed in the pre-op bay, chart in hand, and I watched her register my face. The recognition. The confusion. And this is the moment that made me understand everything I needed to understand about my mother. Her face changed. Not into relief, not into gratitude, into panic. She pulled at the oxygen mask with one weak hand and rasped, "Not her! I don't want her!" Her voice was thin, raspy, but the words were clear. She looked at the charge nurse, a woman she'd never met in her life, and pleaded, "Get me a real surgeon! Someone who didn't need their mother's money just to get through school!" The nurse looked at me. I didn't move. I didn't blink. My mother said it again, louder this time, her heart rate climbing on the monitor. "I want someone else. She panics under pressure. I told them that. I told her program director." "Mrs. Slater." I said it once. Flat. Professional. "I am the only cardiothoracic surgeon in this hospital tonight. There is no one else." She stared at me. The monitor beeped. The fluorescent lights buzzed. And then, from the hallway, from just outside the curtain, I heard my father's voice. And it wasn't quiet. Dale Slater, the man who hadn't raised his voice in 20 years, who sat at the end of every table and said nothing, who let his wife rewrite his daughter's life while he drank his coffee and watched the news.
He pushed through the curtain and he was shaking. His hands, his voice, his whole body. He looked at Lorene. He choked out, "You stop. You stop it right now." She whispered, "Dale." "No!" His voice cracked. He took one step closer to the bed. "No, I can't." He stopped, pressed his hand over his mouth, started again. "That thing you just said, about her needing your money. You said that too. You've been saying that for—" He lost the thread. He turned away from the bed, turned back. His eyes were wet and he was breathing hard. He looked at the nurse. He managed, "My wife didn't pay for. She never." He swallowed. Tried again. "Tessa took out loans. 180. I don't know the exact. 180-something $1,000. She worked. She got a scholarship. She did all of it herself. Every cent." He turned back to Lorene. His voice dropped low, almost hoarse, and the room was dead silent. "You told Phyllis it was 57,000. Or 40. I don't even know what number you used because it changed, Lorene. It changed depending on who you were." He stopped, wiped his face with the back of his hand. "You told the Petersons at church. You told Garrett's in-laws. And I sat there. I sat in that house and I watched you do it and I said nothing and that—" His voice broke. He took a breath. "That is something I will carry for the rest of my life. But I'm not. I can't stand here and listen to you tell these people she's not—" He couldn't finish. He just gestured at me, at the monitors, at the room full of equipment and people who had come running because his daughter was the surgeon on call. Then, quieter, almost to himself, "She is the best surgeon in this building. She has been better than any of us deserved." I stood there with the chart in my hands. The nurse stood there. 2 residents who'd come to assist stood frozen in the doorway. And my mother, Lorene Slater, who always had a response, who always managed the room, who always turned the story. She opened her mouth, and nothing came out. For the first time in my life, my mother had no words. I looked at my dad. He was crying. Not sobbing, just tears running down his face while he stood there with his car keys still in his hand, his coat still on, looking like a man who had finally put down something he'd been carrying since before I was born. I said, "Dad, I need you to step outside now." He nodded. He stepped back. I looked at my mother. She was staring at the ceiling. Her blood pressure was dropping. We were running out of time. I said, "Mrs. Slater, I'm going to repair your aorta now. When you wake up, you can hate me for it. But you're going to wake up." I turned to the team. "Let's move."
The surgery took 6 hours and 14 minutes. Type A dissection with extension into the aortic arch. We went in through a median sternotomy, standard approach, split the sternum, exposed the heart. Once we had her on bypass, I could see the tear. It was extensive. The intimal flap had propagated further than the imaging suggested. We had to replace 3 segments of the ascending aorta with a Dacron graft, reinforce the root, and check every branch vessel for malperfusion. I know that's a lot of medical terminology, but I'm telling you the details because I want you to understand. This was not a simple procedure. This was the kind of operation where you stand for 6 hours without sitting, where one wrong angle on a suture means the patient bleeds out on the table, where your feet go numb and your back screams and you don't notice because the only thing that exists is the tissue under your hands. Maeve was at the head of the table managing anesthesia. At one point, around hour 4, when we'd hit a complication, a small perfusion issue in the left subclavian, she looked at me over her mask and said, "You good?" I said, "I'm good." And I was. My hands didn't shake. Not once. Not for 1 second. The hands Laureen said would gamble with someone's life, they held her life together for 6 hours and 14 minutes. We closed at 4:07 a.m. Heart rhythm stable, graft holding, no residual dissection, no malperfusion. Clean. The team started cleanup and post-op protocols. I stripped my gloves. I pulled down my mask. I told the residents to monitor vitals every 15 minutes and page me if anything changed. Standard stuff. Normal voice, normal face. Then I walked to the staff bathroom on the 3rd floor, the one nobody uses at 4 in the morning, and I locked the door. And I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, and I cried so hard I couldn't breathe. Not because of the surgery was clean. I cried because of what my father said. Because he said it in front of people who now knew. Because for the first time in my life, someone in my family had said out loud that the story Laureen built was a lie. And it had taken her being on the edge of death for him to do it. I sat on that floor for maybe 20 minutes. Then I washed my face, dried my hands, and went back to check on my mother's post-op numbers. She was in the ICU when she woke up. I was there, not as her daughter, as her surgeon. I checked her incision, I reviewed her vitals, I explained the procedure and the recovery timeline. She'd need 6 to 8 weeks before normal activity, cardiac rehab, follow-up imaging at 30 days. She didn't look at me while I spoke. She looked at the ceiling, the same way she had in the pre-op bay. When I finished, she said one word. "Dale?" I said, "He's in the waiting room." She closed her eyes. I left the room, and I remember thinking, this isn't how it looks in the movies. There was no apology, no dramatic embrace, just a woman on a hospital bed asking for her husband, and her daughter walking away with nothing resolved except the thing that mattered most. I'd saved her life, and she knew it. The first week after the surgery, I checked on her every morning before my shift. Vitals, incision site, fluid levels. I was thorough. I was professional. I was exactly the surgeon she said I couldn't be, and she watched me do it every single day without saying a word. My dad came to the hospital every morning at 7 and stayed until 8 at night. He sat in the chair next to her bed, and he read the newspaper, and he didn't leave. But something had changed in him. He wasn't quiet the same way anymore. He'd look at me when I came in the room, and he'd nod. Not the old nod, the one that meant, "Please don't make this harder." A new nod, like he was saying, "I see you. Finally." Garrett came on the 3rd day. He brought flowers, white lilies, probably Danielle's idea. He stood at the foot of the bed and he murmured, "Thank God she's okay." And I watched him not look at me while he said it. Not once. The thing about my brother is, I don't think Garrett is a bad person. I think he's a comfortable one. He'd been on the winning side of Laureen's math for so long that questioning it would mean questioning the foundation of everything he'd received. $62,000 for law school, the engagement party, the Christmas where every frame had his face in it. Admitting that our mother had lied about me would mean admitting that the system he'd benefited from was broken. And Garrett, comfortable, careful Garrett, was never going to do that voluntarily. But after Dale's speech in the pre-op bay, there were witnesses. The charge nurse, 2 residents, Maeve, who'd heard it from the hallway. The story spread through the hospital in hours, the way stories do. Did you hear about Slater? Her own mother said she wasn't a real surgeon. On the gurney, while Slater was about to save her life. Maeve told me later what one of the night shift nurses had said in the break room. She'd looked at Maeve and breathed, "I've seen a lot of things in this hospital, but I have never seen a patient try to refuse their own daughter, a surgeon, while that daughter was about to save their life. What kind of mother does that?" I didn't have an answer, but hearing that someone else said it out loud, someone who didn't know my family, who had no reason to take sides, it meant more than I expected. Within a week, Aunt Phyllis called my dad. Not my mother, my dad. She asked, "Dale, is it true what you said at the hospital? About the money?" He said, "Yes." She pressed, "All of it?" "All of it." I don't know exactly what happened in the family after that. I wasn't there for the calls, the group texts, the uncomfortable conversations. But I know this. Phyllis called me 10 days after the surgery. She was crying. She managed, "Tessa, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. All these years I thought, your mother told me. I'm just so sorry." I said, "I know, Aunt Phyllis." And I meant it. Because the thing about Laureen's lies is, they worked because she was good at them. She chose people who trusted her. She told the story so many times and so consistently that doubting it would have meant doubting her entirely. And who does that to their own sister? Not everyone responded the way Phyllis did. My Uncle Frank, Phyllis's husband, called my dad about 3 weeks after the surgery, and the first thing he demanded was, "Why did you have to do that at a hospital, Dale? In front of strangers?" He wasn't angry about the lie. He was angry about the exposure. 2 months later, at a family birthday I didn't attend, my cousin Reagan apparently told Phyllis that I'd humiliated Laureen, and that whatever happened between them should have stayed between them. This from the woman who'd posted the church fundraiser photo. I'd be lying if I said that didn't sting. But by that point, about 2 months out, maybe early May, something else had shifted. Colleagues at work who I barely spoke to started nodding at me differently in the hallways. Not pity, something closer to respect or recognition. A surgical resident I'd never trained came up to me after a staff meeting and added, "Dr. Slater, I just wanted to say, I heard what happened, and I think what you did was extraordinary." I thanked her. I didn't know what else to say. The story had moved beyond my family. It existed in the hospital now, with people I'd never told, and in versions I couldn't control. That part was complicated. 3 months after the surgery, May 2023, I got a letter from my dad. Not a text, not a call. A handwritten letter on yellow legal pad paper, folded in a white envelope with my work address on it. It was 2 pages. I won't share all of it because some of it is just for me. But there was one part, one paragraph that I keep in my desk drawer at work. He wrote, "I should have said something at that kitchen table in 2005. I should have said something every day after. I didn't because I was afraid of what it would cost, and I let you pay instead. That is my fault, and I won't dress it up as anything else. There are some things you wait your whole life to hear, and when they finally come, they don't fix anything. They just make the next morning a little easier to walk into. I read that letter in my office with the door closed, and I thought about the girl sitting at the yellow laminate table with the pre-med brochure, and I wished I could tell her, "You're going to be okay." Not because someone rescues you, because you rescue yourself. And one day, your dad catches up.
It's been almost 3 years now. I'm 38. I still work at Lakeview. I was promoted to sole director of the cardiothoracic unit in September 2024, when Dr. Sorensen retired after 21 years. My name is on the door now. Dr. Tessa Slater, Director, CT Surgery. Some mornings I walk past it and I still don't fully believe it's real. My mother recovered from the surgery. Her heart is functioning well. I know because I review her follow-up imaging when it comes through the system. She sees a different cardiologist for her outpatient care now. I referred her myself. I'm her surgeon, not her doctor. There's a difference. We don't talk. Not since the hospital. She hasn't called. I haven't called. My dad says she's adjusting, which I think is his way of saying she hasn't figured out how to rebuild her story yet. For 20 years, Laureen Slater had a version of me that worked. The struggling daughter, the ungrateful recipient of her generosity. That version died in a pre-op bay at 4 a.m. when Dale Slater opened his mouth for the first time in his life. And she hasn't built a new one yet. Garrett and I exchanged a few texts last fall. Surface level. Happy Thanksgiving. Hope you're well. He hasn't acknowledged what happened. I don't expect him to. Some people can look directly at the truth and see around it. Garrett's always been good at that. Danielle sent me a separate message in December. Just 4 words. I believe you, Tessa. I stared at it for a long time. I still don't know what to do with it. My dad drives up from Burnsville about once a month now. He sits in my apartment. I moved to a 2-bedroom in Linden Hills last March. $1,850 a month near the lake. And he drinks coffee and we talk. Not about Laureen, not usually. We talk about his garden. He started growing tomatoes after he retired. He's bad at it. The plants keep dying and he keeps replanting them, and I think there's something in that. But I'm not going to say what because I think you already know. Last Sunday, he brought me a tomato. One single, small, slightly lopsided tomato. He set it on my kitchen counter and offered, "From the 3rd attempt." I said, "It's perfect." He smiled. "It's not, but it grew." Maeve and I still work together. She came over one evening last October with a bottle of wine, and we sat on my balcony and watched the sun go down over the lake. She murmured, "You know what I think about sometimes? That night, when your mom was on the gurney." I said, "What about it?" She added, "You didn't hesitate. Not for a second. I was watching your hands when you realized it was her, and they didn't move." I said, "That's the training." She whispered, "No, that's you." And I think she's right. I think it is me. I think every hour I spent in that anatomy lab, every ramen dinner, every loan payment, every morning I woke up and chose to keep going when the person who was supposed to believe in me the most told the world I was failing. All of it built the surgeon who stood in that pre-op bay and didn't flinch. So if you're still listening, and I hope you are, because you just sat through my whole story and that means something to me, thank you. I mean that. It's not easy to tell this,
and it's not easy to hear it. And the fact that you stayed means more than you know. If this story reached you, if any of it felt familiar, would you hit that like button? And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd be honored if you did. Not for the numbers, but because there are more stories like mine out there, and they deserve to be heard. I want to ask you something before I go. Have you ever saved someone who didn't think you could? Not in a hospital, in any way. Have you ever been the person they doubted, and then the person they needed? Tell me about it. I want to hear your story. And if you're looking for more, there's another story waiting for you right now on this channel. Someone else who kept going when they had every reason to stop. My name is Tessa Slater. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon, and the woman who told me I'd gamble with someone's life owes hers to my hands. Some mornings, I still get to the hospital before anyone else. I make coffee in the break room. I sit by the window on the 5th floor where you can see the parking lot and the trees along the access road. The sun comes up behind the east wing, and the light hits the tile floor in long stripes. I just sit there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just still, just steady, just here.